Perfect. Excellent. If I ever pause for a moment, it's because I'm letting people in, just so you know. Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm very excited to have you all here today. Just to begin, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. So here at York Region Food Network, our work and values are intimately connected to land and its people. We live and work on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Anishinaabe peoples. We recognize the ongoing process of colonialism and how it's destroyed traditional food systems. And many of our practices, including our organizational structure, the seeds we plant, the foods we prepare, and the ways we educate, our methods of growing, harvesting, and preparing food have all come to these lands through colonialism. We have a fundamental responsibility to not just acknowledge the traditional lands we're on, but to work every day to unlearn and relearn our history. We're committed to honoring our responsibilities as treaty people as a part of the Williams Treaty and Treaty 13, and the role we play in reconciliation. Thank you. Oops, sorry, I'm just letting a few more people in. So today we have a handful of folks here. We have food council members, we have some working group members that are part of the emergency food cluster, some youth food committee folks, and I believe some garden network folks as well. And we also have some York Region Food Network staff. So I know many of us have a good grasp on food security and food insecurity, but in the words of Food Secure Canada, food security is a goal, while food sovereignty describes how we get there. And we want to better understand how to get there piece. So as a council, working groups, and staff, I hope that today will provide us a better understanding of food sovereignty and will inspire us and strengthen our conversations and direction moving forward. So I know we don't have much time here today, so I'm just going to jump right into introducing our guests. First, we have Afua Asantewaa. Afua is a food security worker and sustainable farmer with over 10 years of experience working in underserved communities in Canada and Ghana. In Toronto, she began her work in food security with African Food Basket and eventually worked with Food Share as the Senior Good Food Program, and Community Engagement Coordinator. At Food Share, Afua implemented Toronto's Pioneer Produce mobile market and Public Health's Grab Some Good Subway produce markets. And we also have with us Maya Lewis. So Maya is the Research and Communities Convener Assistant at Food Secure Canada. She is currently working to complete her degree in Urban Geography and GIS at McGill University. And with past experience as a chef and community cook, she is delighted to make the transition from the kitchen to the office and to bring her commitment to anti-racism and decolonization to the forefront of the work she is doing. So thank you very much both for being here. We're so excited to hear what you have to say. And without further ado, I'll let you take it away and I will start sharing the slides in just one moment.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction, Morgan, and thank you to everybody for having us here today. We're really excited to sort of get the ball rolling on a conversation more about food sovereignty and the ins and outs of creating a sustainable food system that works with the people that it's for and the times that it's for.
There. Sorry. Is
Perfect.
that better?
Are the slides? Yeah, wonderful. Okay. I'm going to get started with a little bit of background info just on FSC, about definitions and housekeeping, stuff like that. And then I'll hand it over to Afua in a couple minutes. So I would love to move to the next slide, please, Morgan. Thank you. Okay, real quick, a bit about Food Secure Canada. The organization that Afua and I have been at for just over half a year now. So we are a pan-Canadian alliance of organizations and individuals working together to advance food security and food sovereignty. built upon 3 pillars of commitment. So 3 things that we believe in that drive our work, as you can see, are zero hunger, first of all, enough food to go around for everybody, a sustainable food system. So as I was mentioning, just food systems that don't end with us, that keep the legacy going for future generations and future modifications to the food systems that we have. And then, of course, healthy and safe food for everybody, because the point of a food system where everyone has access to food only really works if they have access to food that nourishes their body and keeps us running. So upon those 3 pillars of commitment, we have 3 ways to get there, 3 sort of tools in our toolkit that we like to use to advance food security and food sovereignty. First of all, facilitation, to facilitate a dynamic and accessible information hub, as you can see, to foster democratic debate on food policy. So we're all about bringing people together. We're here to support networks to facilitate learning and collaboration. Again, a lot of what we do is by and for the people in the food systems in which we operate. So the last little point on this slide is to advocate for food policies at the federal level. We do a lot of policy work here at Food Secure Canada. It's all about giving voices to people within our food system who might otherwise have been silenced in the past based on the institutions that our food systems were built around. So yeah, that's a little bit about us, what we do, how we like to do it, just about our history. FSC was built upon the following resolution. It was at a food security conference back in 2001, in which the people decided that the conference resolves that there is a need for a national Canadian food security network, and that the organizing committee has the temporary mandate to explore ways of facilitating this and opening it up to a broad-based national membership. From there, Food Secure Canada was born out of passionate food secure actors like us, like you, who really wanted to make a difference. And now, more than 20 years later, we host our own conferences, we mobilize resources for other groups to find actors and to come together. And that is one of my personal favorite parts of my job, is seeing people come together and seeing that action mobilize. Moving on to our next slide, please. Wonderful. So I'd love to get the ball rolling in this conversation. I want to know a little bit more about who we have with us today. So if you'd like to drop in the chat what part of the food system your work lies in and where you see yourself fitting into our food systems, please feel free. Also feel free to shout it out loud if you'd like to. But I'm opening up the floor to anybody who wants to tell us a little bit about where in the food system your work lies. It is also all good if you'd rather not. Just a little curious about where everyone's coming from. Wonderful. Hi, Sophie. Sophie assists with food programs and policy work at YRFN. Lovely to have you here, Sophie. Hi, Jessica. Looks like we have an urban agriculture coordinator. Wonderful. Super happy you could join us too. And hi, Candace. Candace works in public health, focuses on the elements of the food system: growing, processing, consumption, and waste. Wonderful. Okay, so even with those 3 little shout outs, hi Sue from Community Development and Investments at York Region. All right, incredible. It looks like we've got a whole bunch of different steps in the food system accounted for today. I will invite everyone to keep on introducing themselves in the chat, just in case, just to facilitate some connections. And thank you so much for sharing where you're all coming from today. I'm going to move on to the next slide. And with that, we can start discussing what we're here for today. So I've been told that a lot of you are very familiar with food security, food insecurity, all that jazz, and that today we're here to talk about food sovereignty and what it is. So La Via Campesina actually coined the term food sovereignty in 1996 at the World Food Summit. That was just over 25 years ago. And the organization that coined La Via Campesina describes itself as an international peasants movement. It's a global network, not unlike FSC, but at a broader scale, and focusing very specifically on food producers. Sorry to hear that, Janelle, is it? Please take care of yourself. Give yourself a little massage. Sorry, where was I? A global network of food producers. So farmers, fishers, migrant workers, and they come together to learn from each other and to take collective action in defense of land, water, and workers' rights. So that's sort of a little bit of the background of where this term of food sovereignty is coming to us. And I think by now some of you will have had the chance to read through the definition on the slide, which is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. So in the next slide, we will go over the difference between that and food security. So food security, as I'm sure a lot of us are aware, can simply mean having enough to eat, having enough calories to keep our bodies running, to keep our bodies healthy, having enough nutrients to function physically. And food security is concerned mainly with the protection and the distribution of existing food systems and making sure that those existing food systems reach everyone. But it is not so much concerned in most circles with the reevaluation of said systems based on the changing needs of our communities. Now, food insecurity, again, I get the feeling that I am going over some prior knowledge, but please stay patient with me on this one. It's when people do not have access to food. That can be through financial or spatial restraints or otherwise. And the spatial aspect of food insecurity, what I find really interesting about it is that it can happen at almost any level, so global down to body level. For example, living in a rural location, relying heavily on imports, that can increase food insecurity, as well as disabilities and mobility issues that restrict free movement to and from food sources. So when we think about food insecurity, I really like to think about these different levels of it and how it plays through in a lot of different scales in daily life, and how those different scales can stack up, as in intersectionality and all of that jazz. So the difference between these two definitions that we're talking about. Food security is a great preliminary measure of the state of affairs of people in our food system, but it does have its limitations, and that is where food sovereignty often comes in. So a lot of people say that the definition of food security has little mention of sustainability, environmental or otherwise. and that its concern is outreach of access to food, which is wonderful. Going off of that as well, food sovereignty was sort of born out of the strive to end food security in a sustainable way, in a way that we can see continuing to work years, centuries in the future. So for future generations as well as current ones. And as Morgan kindly said in her introduction of us, at Food Secure Canada, we describe food security as a goal, while food sovereignty describes a way to achieve that goal. And that little tidbit of information has helped me personally a lot, trying to figure out my definitions as I entered into this field. So let's move on to the next slide. And I'm going to open up the floor again, actually, to anyone who might be able to think of an example where someone does have food security, but does not have food sovereignty. As a little refresher, food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy, culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound, sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food systems. Would anyone like to take a stab at this? No worries if we're feeling shy. I do have some examples for us if nobody wants to step in, but I'd love to hear your ideas. So if anyone has anything on their mind.
I might step in and say something since no one else is at the current moment. I'm
Absolutely,
just thinking,
go for it.
I'm just thinking like when someone has, like sufficient access to all their food, all their cultural food, everything they really want to be eating, but like if it's not produced in the way that they want it produced, or if they want more local food, but they're having to import from further away, or even vice versa, like they don't necessarily like the local food, but would rather be importing from, a country of origin or something like that, because it tastes better from their country of origin. That's just sort of the first example that comes to my mind.
Entirely. No, you sort of hit the nail right on the head with that one. That's one of the examples that I had written down too. So food security without food sovereignty can look like a lot of things. As Morgan said, it can look like somebody who, for example, has walkable access to a chain grocery store and enough income for all of their family's groceries, but is not given the choice to purchase any food produced organically, sustainably, locally, or from fair trade sources. So does not have the choice to engage in the food systems that they want to support. Another example that I had been thinking of earlier today is, let's talk about the case of an Indigenous person who has plenty of access to imported food, but might be prohibited from practicing their people's hunting practices. And therefore they can't sustain themselves on a culturally relevant diet based on the learnings of their family and their culture. So that can feel really alienating to be part of a food system that doesn't advocate for you and that doesn't see your way of eating as viable. So that's sort of what happens when we have food security and not food sovereignty. And ideally, we would love to have both, of course. We're going to move on to the next slide. And with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to my coworker, Afua. Please take it away. Tell us a little bit more about food sovereignty. Let's do a little deep dive.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So when we say food sovereignty, there are some factors that impact food sovereignty for many people on a daily basis. if you look at the examples below, how do you think they have an impact on people's food sovereignty? Anyone? I would like this to be interactive. I don't want to be speaking to you. I'd like people to jump in and, or even in the chat, make a comment. Because listening to my voice on and on might tend to bore you, no? So we on slide, sorry. We on slide 7, is it?
Yes, slide 7.
Anyone?
Afua, we've got somebody in the chat asking, could you please repeat the question? I think you might be muted.
Okay, my apologies on that. Sorry, I was asking that when you look at the examples on the slide, how do you think they impact people's food sovereignty? Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm ahead of myself. My apologies. When you think of the term food sovereignty, it immediately implies social relationships free of oppression and inequality. It promotes transparent trade with fair incomes for producers. And when we say transparent trade, would anybody know what I mean by that? Any idea? So you know that a lot of our foods come from all over the world, right? But do you know who produces your food? So when you, let me see, when you go to the grocery store and you go for your favorite produce, right? So for some of us who are, for lack of a better word, immigrants, when I go to the grocery store and I go for green bananas, right? Because I'm from the Caribbean, we boil green bananas. We need to take into account who is growing that. Now, is that person being paid a fair wage for what they're growing? So that's what we mean by promoting transparent trade. Are they being, not only are they being paid a fair wage, but what are their working conditions? Move away from green bananas, or me buying my green bananas at the grocery store. When you think of the strawberries and the blueberries and the apples that you eat, mostly, let's say in the summertime, right? Are you aware of who's growing those fruits? A lot of it is grown by migrant workers. Our food system is heavily dependent on migrant workers. But do you know what living conditions they are in, right? Do you know what their wages are? Are you aware that they leave their families for maybe 7, 8 months a year to come here to produce our fruits and vegetables, right? So that's what we refer to as transparent trade with fair incomes fair incomes. And also when you say fair incomes for producers, here in Canada, farmers will tell you that big corporations come buy their foods on huge volumes, and because they're buying in huge volumes, they pay them little to nothing. So farmers do not really make a living wage on farming. And you might not believe so, because every time you go to your grocery store, the grocery store is packed with produce. But what is the farmer receiving for his labor? Or the person who produces the food? What are they being paid? I know you can read, so I'm not going to read the slide to you. along with the items on the slide, I should also mention that foremost, La Via Compensia states food sovereignty safeguards the interest and inclusion of the next generation to be able to produce healthy food. So food sovereignty always takes into consideration the generations that will come after us. So right now, as we all know, we are busy feeding ourselves. We have not been given consideration to the next generation who will be coming after us. So, and climate change is a result of that, right? Northern communities now are having difficulty with sourcing the traditional foods because climate change is basically melting ice. So they have difficulty getting to what they'll call country foods, right? So if right now our northern communities are already experiencing an inability to feed themselves, imagine what's going to come down the pipeline for the next generations. Next slide, please. So below are some factors that impact food sovereignty for many people on a daily basis. As you can see, we have access to water, we have climate, we have culture. How do you think culture impacts food sovereignty? Again, I ask anyone to jump in. I keep saying I do not want to bore you. Anyone? How do you think culture can have an impact on one's food sovereignty?
I see someone with a raised hand, so we're going to call on Samantha.
Oh,
you have the floor.
I remember when you read the definition of food sovereignty, you mentioned culturally appropriate foods. So I feel like there can't be true food sovereignty without having access to culturally appropriate foods.
Exactly. And when Maya said culturally appropriate foods, let's go back to indigenous people, right? Particularly Inuit people. When the campaign to stop the seal hunt, right? Because we have such a Eurocentric food system that focuses on what is so-called in the Canada Health Food Guide, in the food guide, right? The campaign did not give thought to the impact that stopping the seal hunt would have on indigenous people. They, in the wintertime, for a lot of the year, they depend on the fat, right, of the seal to survive, yet still, because that's not part of our cultural, our food or our customs, we felt it was okay, right? Because we believe killing animals is not correct. There's an issue with that. What we don't give consideration to is that indigenous people have always hunted sustainably. They have never overhunted. They have not destroyed their environment by overhunting, but because in the West, or our Western food system or Eurocentric food system has an industrialized food system that has serious impact on the environment, everyone just assumed it's the same thing with the seal hunt. So the campaign devastated the way of life of indigenous people. And again, it's a reminder of how we tend to think that our Western food system is the best, and that when we decide somehow something should not be eaten, we should stop eating meat, everything should be a meat-based diet, we need to also consider that other cultures, they need certain foods for survival. Next slide, please. So if we look at the same examples, can you think of any way that these factors could possibly impact your community? Anyone? So let's look at distribution, right? Distribution is one of a part of our food system. And as I said earlier, we have a global food chain. We have food in Canada that comes from all over the world. And in a way, I say thank goodness, because I also get my cultural foods. Now, a few months ago, there was a lettuce shortage. Do you recall this? Anybody? And do you remember the price of lettuce? I remember going into a restaurant trying to order a Caesar salad, and I was told they didn't have Caesar salads. Never mind, it was on the menu, because lettuce was so expensive, right? And what did that do to us here? The price of lettuce just soared, right? So distribution also have an impact on our food system or food sovereignty. Next slide, please. So, what does culturally appropriate food mean? Anyone?
If I may, I'm just going to act as a little spokesperson for the chat. Jessica dropped in the chat a little while ago that culture affects what foods we are used to and what foods we enjoy.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Taste plays into this a whole bunch.
Thank you, Jessica. I must admit that I do not multitask. I cannot do presentations and pay attention to the chat. So Maya, thank you. So do you think that culturally appropriate food only means being able to walk into a grocery store and having access to your food? Or being able to buy your food? Anyone?
We have a raised hand from Samantha. Please go ahead.
Samantha, go ahead.
Thank you, Maya. I would say solely being able to access it like physically isn't enough. Like it actually has to be accessible in like financially as well, like economically. Mm-hmm. And the quality as well, like taste was mentioned. So if it doesn't taste good, or it's on the verge of like expiry as well, that's not truly accessible to, I would think. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's also that as you said, on the verge of being rotten. And you often walk into grocery stores where you see so-called ethnic food is sitting there and looking absolutely horrible. But grocery stores believe because they've made it available, right? We should ever be so grateful that they did, you know? And if communities were in control or had food sovereignty, they would be able to grow their own foods. Again, I go back to indigenous communities. If they had access to hunt, as Maya mentioned, they would be able to get their country foods, right? But guess what? Wild foods cannot be sold in Canada. It's illegal to sell wild foods, or what they call the traditional foods. And that is in indigenous country, in their land. They are not allowed to walk into a grocery store and get the foods in the grocery store. Instead, what they get, especially up north, is high calorie foods, which is devastating their health, right? Next slide, please.
If I may add something, if you don't mind, Afua, I also wanted to get us thinking about institutions and the roles that institutions play in access to food and access to culturally appropriate food. So it's one thing to have the choice of seeing the foods that you grew up with and the foods that you like to eat at the grocery store. But let's also keep thinking about school foods and standardized meals in, for example, prison systems, in, for example, hospitals, places where very vulnerable populations are relying on institutions to provide them with food. And I invite you to think about whether or how well institutions have offered different cultural food choices in your experience. I think that's something to keep thinking about.
Thank you, Maya. In explaining culturally appropriate food, participants in 4 stories, you'll see a reference to that at the end of this, have explained that every land has its own seed. What do you think that means? Every land has its own seed. Anyone? Okay, we're going to go back to, again, food sovereignty, right? And I'm going to continue using indigenous people because it's a perfect example to do that. So every land has its own seed, which means that the biodiversity and ecology supports the seeds of this land, right? So global, trying to get people, particularly indigenous people, to adopt a global diet is completely against their way of life. And of course, I'm not saying that, indigenous people should not be eating apples or, for oranges or bananas, but it's that when they do not have access to their own foods, it's almost like saying, what Mother Nature has provided here is not good enough, so we are going to do better, right? So indigenous people not being able to access lands for the medicinal purposes, and again, to hunt, is saying that basically the Eurocentric way of eating is the better way, the superior way, or as I said earlier, not allowing or banning country foods, which is wild meats in particular, is completely against the culture, the lifestyle, and nature. This is what nature provided here, Mother Nature provided here for indigenous people. Just because we have invaded the lands does not mean nature has changed. Nature continues to be the same way it's always been. Yet still we are forcing indigenous people to adapt to a food system or taking away their right to food sovereignty, which is to be able to eat the way they want and the way that supports their culture. Next slide, please. So when we talk about decolonizing our food systems, what do you think? What do you think we mean by that? Again, I'm asking anyone to jump in. What does the term mean to you? Anyone? No one? Okay, I'll jump in. So when you look at the Canada Health Food Guide, right, it is a very Eurocentric model for eating. It does not take on, well, I know it has been revamped or is still being revamped, but again, it still does not take into consideration the diets of I'll say indigenous people. They are the first peoples of this land, it does not take into consideration their way of eating at all. It states that you need to have high starch, you need to have high, now beans, peas, and moving away from meat. But again, that perception of a plant-based diet is better than meat measures everybody on the Eurocentric standard, right? What about people up north who need to have meat for their survival, right? We know that we need vitamin D. They get it through the organs of what they hunt, right? And it is brutally cold and it is dark up north. How are they going to get their vitamin D, right? If we say they need to try to survive on a plant-based diet. So by decolonizing our food systems, we are referring to basically accepting that the Eurocentric model of the food system, of our food system, is not the only way. If we respect land treaty rights Canada signed with Indigenous peoples, that would be decolonizing the food system because they would have access again to hunt, to fish, right? So you must know, you must have heard how outrageously expensive food is in the north, right? Milk, expensive compared to down here. If we had non-profit food markets and we had transportation of traditional foods, that would go very, very far in decolonizing our food system. If Indigenous people had food sovereignty, basically control of how to grow the food, what they grow, again, that would be part of decolonizing our food system. As I said earlier, removing the ban on the sale of country foods. Indigenous people cannot walk into a grocery store and buy wild meat. What they can buy instead is meat that has been grown in an industrialized system that is grown on heavy pesticides and hormones. And this is what they're subject to eating instead of their wild meats. Does anybody have any questions in regards to what I just said? Or any comments, anything else to add?
I've just gotten a message in the chat from Morgan saying it is illegal to bring seeds into the country from other countries, and this prevents people from bringing their foods to grow themselves in Canada and adapt their seed varieties to a Canadian climate.
Exactly. And sadly, okay, so we'll talk about okra, right? Many Asian, South Asian cultures, Caribbean cultures, and African cultures, we eat okra. Canada, for the longest time, has been able to, right at Guelph, I believe, to grow okra right here. But nobody cares to grow it because there is a lot more profit to be made from importing it into the country and selling it at a high cost to us. Anyone else? Next slide, please. Oh, I believe we are over time, Morgan.
Technically, yes. We said we'd end at 2:45. So it's up to you if you want to keep going, or people are welcome to leave if they need to. Yeah, I'll let you decide if you want to tie it up or if you have a little bit of time for some Q&A.
Yeah,
it's up to you.
That's okay. Can we take 5 minutes or so to do that, please?
Of course.
Any questions? Okay, I'll ask, does everybody now have a better understanding of what food sovereignty means in comparison to food security that you hear more often than food sovereignty? Basically, we are looking for accolades to say we did a great job on presenting about food sovereignty. I see a comment.
Yeah, I appreciated learning the definitions from you guys, and I appreciated the distinction of even you know, food security is the goal, and food sovereignty is sort of the way that the path that we're going to take to get there. If I got that correctly. So yeah.
And right now you'll hear that the indigenous community is, I believe, between 45 to 69% food insecure, depending on where the community is. Now, if they had food sovereignty, again, how, where, and distribution of the food, there would not be food insecurity, or there would be less food insecurity. So again, some of them have access to food, very unhealthy foods, but that does not mean they have food sovereignty, because they have no control of the foods they eat. It is in the hands of someone else or huge corporations, right? Canada subsidizes the grocery store up north. Prices are outrageous, absolutely outrageous. Canada subsidizing Nutrition North, which is a program that subsidizes food into fly-only communities in northern Ontario, but yet still, these communities are still highly food insecure. That is because we are supporting a broken system. It's not working, yet still we are not trying to make a change to allow people or to support people to develop food sovereignty and lessen food insecurity in their communities. I'm going to stop there. If you have any questions, feel free, you can email me.
Could I ask a question?
Oh,
Yeah. So because we're, as a food council, we have all these projects projects on the go or initiatives on the go where we're thinking about incorporating more of a food sovereignty lens. I was wondering if either of you have any tips or recommendations or just words of wisdom when it comes to incorporating a food sovereignty lens into our work.
All right, can I go ahead, Maya?
Yeah, for sure. I might add something at the end, but please go ahead.
Thank you. I would say most importantly, reach out to Indigenous people, right? Do not do this on your own. Indigenous people have been fighting for food sovereignty for such a long time compared to, so people of African descent are the second most highest population to be food insecure. But Indigenous people have been at food sovereignty for a very long time. And I think they would be the best people to reach out to. Don't do this on your own. We often sit in our offices. We don't go into the communities and ask, right? But go into the communities, right? Reach out to Indigenous people and speak to them. And also reach out to Black people and ask them.
Yeah, I would just add that food sovereignty as being developed as a sort of by the people for the people movement requires active participation from community members. It's all about nothing about us without us, as I'm sure we're familiar with, but it's about getting people together and starting a dialogue, asking what people would like to see out of their own food systems instead of deciding what's best for them, and it's a give and take instead of just an offer.
Yeah, thank you both so much for that. we'll definitely take that to heart as we move forward with our projects for sure. I see that Sophie has a question in the chat as well. She asked, does it look like the Nutrition North program is here to stay, or is it looking like it'll be stopped?
It seems to be here to stay because I have not seen anything being developed to take over. Right? I have not seen anything differently being put in place. And also I haven't heard any work is being done to stop the ban on country foods, right? So, anyone else?
I have another question. I was kind of curious, Afua, what you're working on with food sovereignty at Food Secure Canada. I know, like from what I've read or what I've heard or even seen in emails from Food Secure Canada, I know that you're a part of this huge food sovereignty. I don't know, I want to call it a movement around Canada. So I was curious if you could mention that briefly and say what you're doing there.
So Maya and I, both of us are working on the same project. It's called Indigenous and Black People's Food Sovereignty Planning Project. So basically, it's a one-year project to work across Canada with Indigenous and Black communities to support them in amplifying their voice, because they've been doing food sovereignty work in their communities for many years, but it's that generally it is white women who you am more about in the food movement. So this project is about giving space or bringing to light the work that Indigenous and Black people have been doing to feed themselves, basically. And Maya is working on an amazing part of the project, which is developed. Oh, you know what, Maya? You're here. Speak for yourself.
Yeah, I'll gladly jump in. So my background in geoinformational systems and mapping lends me very well to the part of this project that involves creating a network map of Black food systems and Indigenous food systems in Canada. So different actors, projects, organizations by, for, and surrounding Black and Indigenous food sovereignty. So it's been really interesting to carry out. We're going to have a geospatial map that sort of shows little points of where the work is being done. We're going to have more of a like theoretical network map that shows the different avenues of work that are being done. But the big takeaway that I've had personally working on this project is that this work may not be heard about like very a lot of people might not have heard about this work, but it is being done, and it has been being done. And a lot of people going into this sort of start from scratch or assume that they have to, which is not the case at all. I've had the pleasure of making a whole bunch of new connections with food movement actors, specifically Black and Indigenous food movement actors who have been advocating for our involvement in our own food systems for dozens of years. And yeah, the project that we're working on is sort of just spreading awareness and creating that pan-Canadian dialogue, which is very exciting.
And I'll add that actually, because of this work and that the aim of this work is to create policy change, right? That the needs and the priorities of Indigenous and people of African descent here is taken into consideration. So late last year, the Ministry of Agriculture undertook consultations with communities or with Canadians for input in the developing national food policy, right? Now, as I mentioned, after Indigenous people, Black people are the most food insecure. The National Food Policy will also has a component for a universal school feeding program, right? And $1 billion has been provided for the school feeding program for the next 5 years. The government did consultations, basically almost the last day of consultations, Black people were reached out to. So the government is working directly with Indigenous people, and rightfully so. On the other hand, we were called last minute and told that there are 5 spots available at a round table, and we needed to give a response the same day that we were contacted to participate in this round table. Well, we were pissed. And right after the round table, a group of us who participated wrote the Ministry of Agriculture a scathing letter of how racist, the system is, and how, with being stakeholders, because we are highly food insecure, we felt slighted that basically our priorities do not matter. We got a response. Tomorrow we'll be meeting with the ministry, 2 ministries, to table our demands to ensure that our voices are heard in the development of a national food policy. We want to ensure that, particularly for the school feeding program, we get culturally appropriate foods. We do not want what our children have been fed daily. And we want to ensure that members of our communities, various communities all across Canada, because this is a national program, will also participate in whatever financial gain there is to be had from this, from a national food policy or a national school feeding program. So we have farmers who are struggling, they don't have access to land, they are renting land or they're on community space growing food. We want to ensure they are prepared that when this school food policy rolls out, they too can be suppliers. We have nutritionists who ought to be able to develop, use our culturally diverse foods to say this needs to be part of our school food program, and then be supported in creating educational information to say why sweet potato is as wonderful as an Irish potato, or a potato, right? You see now sweet potato is available in restaurants like crazy, but do you think you'll ever see that in a school feeding program? No. So we want the government to make an allowance for us that we participate in this as equally and on the same foot as everybody else. So as of tomorrow, we'll be meeting with the ministry, and this is what this project has done. It has given us a voice. It's to bring about policy change. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I hope that meeting goes well tomorrow. I see now that it's 3 o'clock, so we've definitely keeping you 15 minutes beyond what we asked of you. Would it be okay if I share a PDF of the slides with everyone and maybe your email address in case anyone has any lingering questions?
Could we formalize the slide before and then send it to you?
Of course, that sounds perfect. But I will just thank you both for being here and providing us with so much information, and it's just such rich information as well. And I'm really excited to see where the conversations within the Food Council and the working groups and within our staff, and like where those conversations end up going after this event. So again, thank you so much for being here, and thank you everyone for coming and listening as well. I'll be sending out the recording next week, so if anyone needs to look it over again or wants to just hear what everyone had to say again, you'll be able to do that as well. But I will let you all go, and thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us,
Thank you.
Morgan, and thank you everyone who tuned in.
Thank you.